Further remarks, the good member from the 19th District, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Good amendment. Please vote yes. Madam Speaker, I'm concerned about one element, a mechanical one, in the underlying bill that this amendment addresses. And pardon me for moving away from ambitious talk of hope and dreams. There are mechanical issues in the underlying bill that could imperil it. And while I have questions about the underlying bill, this amendment, I think, really does help. The good gentleman from the 15th mentioned it. There are constitutional problems, potential problems in the underlying policy that could end up derailing the entire project. I think that this amendment is useful in that it addresses several constitutional issues, some having to do with how we award the resources of the state, some having to do with uniform tax issues. There are a couple of constitutional problems in the underlying bill, and I really believe this amendment is a good faith effort to address those problems and prevent some sort of judicial review later down the road that might reverse the whole project. So I do believe this is a good amendment. The other questions of public policy here and what we're doing with housing, etc., I think we can talk about separately. But if there are constitutional defects in the way that the program is set up, that could scotch the whole thing. So yes on this amendment, and I think it clears up potential legal or constitutional problems down the line. Thank you.
Further remarks, the good member from the 19th District, Representative Walsh.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, please vote yes on this amendment. The point I'm going to make is similar to the point I made on a previous amendment. This has to do with potential constitutional defects in the underlying policy. This amendment actually helps remedy them, or at least rectify them somewhat. A risk in the underlying program would be that with the relatively short ownership timeline required, the system might be prone to, I don't know what you want to call it, speculative investment, gaming the system. Now, I'm a capitalist. I don't blame anybody who wants to make money on something however they want to do it. However, if that were to happen with the kinds of loans and kinds of home purchases envisioned by the underlying policy, that would draw attention to the potential Article 8 defects in the gifting of public funds, as we all know and have discussed. That is against the Constitution, our state constitution. So I think the 10-year time frame makes it less likely that clever, aggressive investors might try to use the system to their benefit. And again, no disrespect to them. We're in a capitalist system. They would be doing what's in their interest. But that might draw attention, perhaps from others, perhaps from people who didn't qualify for the program, who might challenge the program on the basis that it's the gifting of public funds under a constitutional argument. That, again, could derail the system. So the 10-year, the little bit longer timeline required to hold the property, I think actually reduces the risk of a constitutional challenge to the program. So I think it helps all of the well-meaning goals of the underlying bill to not be challenged on a constitutional basis. So it's a good improvement. I think it makes challenges less likely. And per the comments we've heard already, 10 years is a reasonable amount of time to say someone should own a piece of real estate or an asset before the other elements of the program would kick in to their advantage. So I'm going to hammer this constitutional point several times, Madam Speaker, because I do think that the constitutional issues are a risk to the underlying program. Please vote yes on the amendment to lessen the constitutional exposure. Good amendment. Please vote yes. As I've mentioned before, my concern around the underlying program, the underlying bill, is that it has some constitutional defects, or at least some potential constitutional defects. I've mentioned it glancingly before, but this amendment is relevant closely to one of those potential defects. Now, the section of the Washington State Constitution that deals with issues like this is Article 8, and it's sections 5 and 7 of Article 8 that set up the language that we know generally as no gifting of public funds. That's the constitutional risk that the underlying program has, that it would be considered a gifting of public funds, particularly the loan forgiveness element of the program. The loans themselves would probably survive that constitutional test, but the forgiveness piece, it would rub up against that prohibition in the Constitution. Now, this amendment helps with that potential defect in the following way. By keeping the income threshold lower, and it's still not super low, but lower than it was currently described in the underlying bill, it does direct the resources of the program a little bit more to the poor and infirm. And the Constitution allows for some leeway in that prohibition on gifting of public funds for projects that assist the poor and infirmed. Now, 80% AMI is still not poor by some standards, but certainly 120% is really not poor by most standards. So I think by keeping the income threshold lower, we could make a more credible argument that this is really directed at lower income families that would satisfy the constitutional loophole to the prohibition because it's assisting the poor and infirm. So again, my interest in this discussion is let's try to remedy the potential defects in the underlying program so that it can go forward and would survive a court challenge. And this amendment helps doing that by keeping the focus of the program on something that might fit into that exception in Article 8. So I understand this is probably more in the weeds than most people want to be, but I believe that this amendment helps the underlying project. So please vote yes on the amendment.
Further remarks.
Speaker, I agree with much of what the good woman from the 26th just said, except one quibble. The state does not ask people to pay taxes. The state tells people to pay taxes. And that's the reason that this amendment is important. Mr. Speaker, we are reaching an inflection point in public policy on the matter of taxes in the state of Washington. And I think that the people in whom all political power is inherent are reaching a point of inflection in their own beliefs about what our state government should do and how it should pay for doing those things. Now, Mr. Speaker, the immediate purpose of this referendum clause to be added to the underlying bill, I believe, is to answer the questions we've raised about the potential constitutional defects in the program, particularly the forgiveness piece of the program. These are not spurious arguments. It is an unusual program, well intended to be sure, but it seems to rub up against the rocks of those Article 8 sections of the state constitution. So it is an unusual proposal. And in the spirit, I believe, of those 50-odd other unusual proposals that warranted a mandated referendum to the people, legislatively mandated. The people, of course, always reserve the right to referendum and overturn by initiative. Mr. Speaker, I believe it is appropriate to the underlying policy to add this element. If we're concerned about honoring the separation of powers and the different branches of government and their interaction, we can always appeal to the highest judges, higher than the state Supreme Court, higher than the U.S. Supreme Court, the people of the state. This is an extraordinary policy proposition. Let's let them decide what they think of it. It's appropriate, it's timely, and Mr. Speaker, if we don't start listening to the people on these matters of public policy and taxation, they are going to take the rights reserved to them on this point and others and start questioning, undermining, reversing, repealing, chiming in, and vetoing actions that we take on this floor. So an ounce of prevention is worth a dozen initiatives, Mr. Speaker. This is the ounce of prevention. Please vote yes.